I created this channel in 2022, a few months after completing my master's degree. I'd known for a long time that I wanted to make this channel, and I felt like it was about the right time. Education is extremely important to me, and I think that the internet can be a great tool for education, as long as the right resources are available. I created this channel with the intention of providing quality academic information to a broad audience, some of whom might have an academic background in history, but most of whom probably would not. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, and the quality can vary tremendously. I'm not saying that one needs to have my academic background in order to create good quality content on the internet. That's not at all what I'm saying. There are plenty of people out there who are making great content who don't have the same background as me. And there's also a lot of crap. However, my education has taught me more than just memorizing names and dates. The things which I imagine a lot of people who questioned my decision to study history seem to have thought it was all about. My education has taught me lots of skills which have helped me get a better grasp of history. Skills which I think lots of people who are interested in history on the internet don't necessarily possess, but I think it would benefit them to learn. The skill I'm talking about here is the ability to place sources about history within their context and understand them in their context. It happens frequently on the internet that I see people or read of people looking at historical sources, reading historical texts completely out of context. And these people are often completely misinterpreting the text or missing a lot of the nuance or a proper understanding of the text that would come from them knowing the context and being able to analyze it with that context in mind. No writings are created in a vacuum. No writings exist in isolation. You can't passively approach these sources and just read them willy-nilly without really understanding anything. You have to be considering, if you want to responsibly analyze a historical text, you have to be thinking about this context as you're reading it. You have to consider where that text fits within the larger conversation around the topic, within the larger genre literature. You need to consider the author. Who is this person? What is their background? What's the culture that they're coming from? What class background? What, work background? What are they trying to say? What are they trying to do with this text? What are their influences? Every author has something that they're trying to say. They're writing for a reason. And trying to understand that reason is going to give you so much information about how you need to read that text, how you need to understand and interpret that text. Oftentimes, an author, if they're talking about specific events, they're interpreting them and narrating them in a certain way. What might they be adding? What might they be removing? What might they just be over or under emphasizing? I thought about making this video while I was doing the research for my last video on talking a lot about Duro of Saint-Quentin's Historia Normanorum, and understanding what he's doing and where he's coming from is very important to understanding that text. Understanding that he's being patronized by the Duke of Normandy to write a history of the Dukes of Normandy is very important to understanding what he's writing, how he's presenting things, knowing what the anxieties of those dukes are. And Dudo kind of tells us a little bit about that in the introduction of his work itself. Understanding these anxieties and what the dukes want out of this genre of text is important to understand what Dudo is doing with the text, and therefore understanding how to read it. This text exists in a milieu amongst others. There are certain tropes, there are certain expectations from this text. Expectations in terms of presentation, in terms of writing style, in terms of even language being used, that you have to keep in mind when reading it and in order to properly understand what it's telling us. It's also important to understand the text's intended audience. who is supposed to be reading this? That will tell us a lot about how it was written, what ideas are trying to be presented, and how much we can read into things. This is often something that people have to keep in mind for letters. Most of the pre-modern letters that we have are not personal correspondences the way we tend to think of them. Usually, when we have letters, these are edited, these are compiled by someone, possibly rewritten, possibly rephrased. Certain letters were chosen and included, others were not. Famously, if you ever take a class on late Republican Rome, you'll probably read some of Cicero's letters. And it's very well known that Cicero's letters, although these were real letters, they were edited, they were compiled, and they were intended to be read widely. So we shouldn't necessarily approach these as just, oh, it's a letter. Whatever it says is the pure, unadulterated personal feelings of the author. Not necessarily, because understanding the context that these things are edited and compiled in such a way that they will be shared should influence how we approach them and how we read them, right? Likewise, something like poetry might be different depending on the audience it's meant for. Lots of literature is going to be different based on the audience it's meant for. But knowing the audience can also change how we read it and how we interpret the audience itself. For a long time, it was suspected that fabliaux literature in the late Middle Ages was meant for a lower class audience or not an aristocratic audience, whereas romance literature was for the courts. Fabliaux, by the way, are very bawdy, very tend to be quite raunchy, comedic literature. But more recent analysis of these texts show that there's some references in these texts which only make sense if the same people reading these are the ones who are familiar with romantic literature. Oftentimes you have themes of romance literature that are turned on their head, and that only really makes sense if it's the same people reading it. And so not only does that affect how we interpret the fabliaux literature, but it also affects how we look at that courtly audience. People had traditionally assumptions that they had to be sort of, upper class and very very prudish, very of a certain way, probably influenced by ideas of class in the 19th and early 20th century. But we're coming to recognize with this that these people liked sex jokes like the rest of us. There are different sides of people, complexities within the court culture. And various people might have had different opinions. I'm not guaranteeing that everyone who enjoyed romance literature was also a fan of fabliaux or vice versa. But it gives us a more complex understanding of the court, the people reading these texts, and the texts themselves. Then you also have questions of transmission. Especially before the printing press, everything's being hand copied. Where is it being copied? Why are some things being copied and not others? The very matter, the material on which it was copied can tell us something. The illuminations, the quality of the paper or parchment, more likely, the quality of the ink, but also the effort. How many transmissions were there? Was it translated? Translations can tell us a whole lot about who's reading this text, what context it's being read in, what the purpose of the text is. Although sometimes you have texts that are translated later on, which might not have been intended for a certain audience, but a certain audience comes to appreciate it, and therefore it gets translated into a language which is more available to certain audiences. When you're looking at translations, you also have to consider the fact that translation is always interpretive, and how a translator is making decisions on how to present certain things. So that can tell us about audience reception, but also an audience receiving a certain translation might be interpreting the text differently than the original because of the choices made by the translator. Even if it's an authentic, if it's a very close translation, there are always compromises and decisions that have to be made. And when I'm talking about authors' intentions and things like that, I'm not necessarily talking about, is the author lying or not? Is this a trustworthy source? That is an important part. And some sources we have to approach thinking, okay, how much can we trust? What extent can we trust? What can we get out of this? What can it tell us about XYZ? But there's also questions of just understanding. Reading is always interpretation. We are not in the minds of the author. Anytime you're reading a text, you are analyzing it. You're coming to an understanding of the author's interpretation, what they put to paper or, onto a computer in the modern day. You are analyzing those words and you are understanding them based on your own background. So it's important to understand as much as possible the background of the person writing it and of the people reading it, if you really want to understand what this text meant at the time, what it meant for the author, what it meant for the people reading it. Understanding context helps us avoid anachronistic interpretations, misunderstanding terms, misunderstanding intent. You have things like feudalism, right? Oftentimes, you'll see people applying this idealized late medieval, even early modern sense of feudalism on texts from the 10th century, where these words weren't necessarily being used in the same sense. Ideas of a beneficium might not imply the same relationship between vassal and lord as they might in later dates. Oftentimes in the earlier Middle Ages and even in the High Middle Ages, these terms didn't have fixed meanings and different people could interpret them differently. So imposing this sort of dictionary definition onto it that comes from a later period, and even then, even in the later periods, was theoretical at best, that can affect how we're understanding these relationships that are being discussed. We might assume that they're more firmly understood, that there is a more, a clearer relationship being applied in context of charters where so-and-so put his hands upon the hands of some other guy and vowed XYZ. What that actually means might differ greatly in one context or another. So yeah, important point there is that reading is always interpretation. Really, analyzing any sources is interpretation. Archaeology has a lot of interpretation, though responsible archaeology takes context into account. Good archaeologists who know a lot of the context, and by good archaeologists, I mean real archaeologists, not just people on the internet who are making conspiracy theories. They know enough about the context to make reasoned assumptions, reasoned interpretations, educated interpretations on the material culture that they find. And you have entire books debating back and forth what's the more reasonable, what's the more realistic interpretation. And that gets me to another point, is secondary literature. Oftentimes I see people on the internet and elsewhere going to primary literature and stopping there. It's good to see primary sources. Primary sources are very important. They are the foundation of an understanding of history. But there are people who have dedicated their entire lives to understanding the context of these works, of this material culture or written culture, what have you. Reading the secondary literature is responsible and valuable. Now, there is different quality of secondary literature, and I'll get back to that in a second. But taking the opportunity to look into the secondary literature surrounding primary literature or other primary sources is really important. And a lot of these ideas should be applied to analyzing secondary literature, because not all things written, be it on the internet or published in books, is of equal quality. These same skills are applied to determining whether a source is reliable. Who published it? Was it peer reviewed? Who wrote it? What are their qualifications? Again, having a PhD in a topic doesn't guarantee that everything you say is going to be gold. But, there's a reason why degrees are issued, and it's because it's supposed to ensure that you have a certain qualification. Again, that doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't have a PhD or a master's or whatever doesn't deserve being listened to, but I'm going to be more likely to rely on a source written by a scholar published at a reliable publishing company, which indicates that there were others who looked at it and who analyzed it. I'm also often going to look at reviews by other scholars to determine the quality of that work. There's a lot of background to read to get a full understanding of a text. It's one of the reasons why my videos take so long to make, because I spend, weeks, sometimes months researching a video before I actually start even writing the script, start even thinking about the script. This is also something to consider when approaching popular or traditional narratives about things. Nationalistic narratives, old-fashioned narratives, and sometimes brand new narratives. I hear all sorts of narratives that have emerged in the past couple of decades about Vikings that that are clear that they don't understand the proper context, and that knowing the context of how these narratives came about can help you analyze how reliable this is. Maybe I need to look into this more. Maybe I need to not so readily spread this information because I don't know necessarily how reliable it can be. And this brings me into something else that I think is very important that these skills help with, and that's critical thinking skills. Being able to analyze texts, and really this is all about thinking critically about them. Critical thinking is an extremely important skill. I think it is underrated. It is one thing that AI will never be good at least not our present language learning models. These critical thinking skills can be applied beyond just history. They can be applied when you're analyzing news sources, when you're doing any sort of research, when you're looking into anything, when you're getting any sort of information, deciding whether a political party is worth voting for, deciding whether, what a politician says is something you should really listen to or really pay much attention to, whether a news source is trustworthy, whether a story needs to be looked into a little bit deeper, be it a news story or just an interpersonal story. Being able to analyze and practicing analyzing and taking these, understanding the context behind historical texts helps you build your ability, build your skills at critical thinking. This also, in the context of history, helps force you, at least this was the case for me, forces you to consider perspectives outside of your own, which I think is a very important skill, interpersonally, professionally, wherever. You're not a medieval cleric. I'm not a medieval cleric. Or you're not whatever person you're reading. In order to properly understand that context, you need to, as much as possible, step into someone else's shoes. And I have found that was incredibly useful for better being able to be more empathetic, to better understand other cultures, other backgrounds, and to respect and really come to appreciate the value of multiple perspectives, of a diverse base of opinions. It certainly helped me better be able to approach people from other cultures, come to understand where they're coming from. And that is an extremely important skill in life, interpersonally or professionally. I think people are often overly focused on seeing higher education as a path towards a specific career, which is why a lot of people scoff at education in the humanities. But that path is more focused on things like critical thinking, which really helps one better navigate the world. I'm not saying that you need a degree to learn critical thinking. I'm also not saying that a degree guarantees that you'll be any good at critical thinking, but I definitely credit my education for helping me with that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Slightly different from what I typically do, but I do think that these more theoretical videos are valuable and important every now and then. I hope you learned from it. I hope it's given you an appreciation of the importance of historical context. And I'll see you all next time.